Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the north in the Kharkiv direction, where the Ukrainians have made a map correction where they previously was reported that they were completely pushed out of the northern part. They did withdraw from it, but then have since returned before the Russians finished cleaning up the northern part. And with that, fighting has returned to the northern parts of Vovchansk as the Ukrainians returned their presence in the northern parts as Russians continue to pressure the Ukrainian positions in the area. The reason for this is that the Ukrainians had laid a lot of mines, IEDs, and other explosives throughout the town, which makes it difficult for anyone to pass through, as buildings are booby-trapped, similar to what the Ukrainians did in the Bakhmut direction during the fighting over the city in the spring of 2023. So with this, we see that the Russians continue fighting in the northern parts as the Ukrainians have returned their presence there and fighting continues in it. The Ukrainians are here conducting counterattacks to attempt to recapture the northern parts of Vovchansk, while the Russians are focusing on defense and holding their positions to prevent the Ukrainians from gaining more territory and to gain full control over the northern parts of the town. This means that the Russians are going to continue their offensive operations with a focus on Vovchansk to gain full control of it, and the Ukrainians are sending further reinforcements to expand their bridgehead across and gain full control or regain full control over Vovchansk. The main fighting here in the northern direction is near Vovchansk and Lipsy, as the Russians are attempting to gain control of Lipsy and Vovchansk, and the Ukrainians are trying to regain control over Vovchansk and prevent a Russian foothold within Lipsy. The current fighting is stalled mostly as the Russians are unable to pressure the Ukrainian forces enough to gain further control over Ukrainian territory. The initial success of the Russians is largely due to the corruption and the non-existence of Ukrainian fortifications in the area. The second line of defense is not properly built, but it is there nonetheless. Combining that with the reinforcements the Ukrainians sent to the north to hold the line near Kharkiv, where they're trying to save land and buy time in exchange for manpower until that they're able to properly receive the aid that the United States has started sending to Ukraine, to send additional reinforcements and ammunition to help hold the line as the Ukrainians built the next lines of fortifications closer to Kharkiv. This is happening both in the direction of Lipsy and Vovchansk. In the meantime, further Russian reinforcements are coming to the northern border between Belgorod and Kharkiv, and there's also a build-up happening near Kursk towards Sumy, near Belgorod towards Sumy, and in the Bryansk region both towards Sumy and Chernihiv regions. So we're seeing a Russian build-up in the northern parts and eastern parts of Ukraine as the Ukrainians are sending reinforcements towards Kharkiv to help hold the line. The Russians are expanding the presence of their troops further northwards in an attempt to divert the Ukrainian forces from the southern and eastern parts of the front line. Further south here in the direction of the Svetove and Kreminna section of the front line, the Russians have captured the majority of Berestove, where fighting has now reached the southern parts of the village. The Russians have advanced both in the central and eastern parts of it, leaving only the southern parts with Ukrainian presence. This has cut off the road from Berestove towards the Oskar River line and between Berestove and Pishane. This could be a start of a new operations by the Russians towards Stelmakhivka, as we see there are operations by the Russians towards Stelmakhivka. Both the geolocated footage from Berestove, the northern and southern parts of it, as well as this fighting near Stelmakhivka, is all geolocated, showing the Russian offensive operations in the area. Based on the reports, the Russians are attempting to fight in a southern direction through Berestove, combining that with an eastern assault from the east of Stelmakhivka to attack Stelmakhivka both from the north and from the east. This would cut off the Ukrainian presence near Novoselivsk as the Ukrainians attempt to counterattack in that direction to regain control over the micro-district of Kuzimivka. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian presence here between Berestove and Stelmakhivka is being challenged by the Russian assaults towards Berestove, cutting off the supplies to the north. With this assault from the east of Stelmakhivka towards the village itself, the Russians may be attempting an operation here to start fighting over the village. At the same time, we see Russian fighting restarting east of Makivka, which could indicate the Russian operation towards the Zherebets river line to gain control over the entirety of the river line from the east of Liman all the way north to the northwest of Svetove. The advantage of attacking Stelmakhivka from the north and the east is that the Russians attacking only from the east would be faced off with the river line in between their positions and Stelmakhivka. Instead, if they attack from the north as well, they'll be attacking from both the eastern and western bank of the river, which would allow the Russians to pressure the Ukrainian positions by Stelmakhivka from both directions. And this will allow the Russians to also cut off the Ukrainian presence by Novoselivsk, which would improve the Russian positions near it. With the capture of Berestove, the Russians will be able to gain control over the northeastern bank of the Zherebets river, and it will allow the Russians to concentrate their forces in the direction of Stelmakhivka rather than having some spending at the Novoselivsk direction. With this, we see that the Russian focus would be in the south of Berestove, but there's also the fact that the Russians could use this as an opportunity to gain control over the heights south of Positional as well to contest the Ukrainian positions there. This will also strengthen the Russian positions here in the direction of the Luhansk and Kharkiv borderline. Further south here in the direction of Bielorivka, the Ukrainians continue counterattacks northeast of the village to try and cut off the supply road from the Russian offensive operations east of the village. However, the Russian positions in the heights northeast of Bielorivka are present with fortifications there as well, which makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to push any further. This means that they're able to cut off this road here, but there are multiple other roads that the Russians have available, and they have fortified positions to hold on to prevent further Ukrainian advances. This means that the Ukrainians are pushing here in the northern direction, but is unlikely to go any further. Further south here in the direction of Sokil, we see that the Russians were facing off against the Ukrainian counterattack near the fortifications northeast of the village. There's been no advances by the Russians in a while, as the Ukrainians have been trying to hold their positions by launching counterattacks and attempting to prevent further Russian advances. But with this, we see that the Ukrainians launched a counterattack with a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle towards the Russian positions northeast of Sokil, after which it was destroyed. Following that, an additional Bradley was sent to recover the infantry through that attack. It was hit and damaged. This means that the Ukrainians' counterattack failed and they did not manage to regain any territory that the Russians had control over. Further south here in the direction of Umanske, the Russians were geolocated to be in the southwestern outskirts of the village, confirming the full Russian control of the village. And with this, we see that the Russians will be moving on to Yasnobrodivka following the full capture of Umanske. And this is the final village of the three by Umanske, Yasnobrodivka, and Netailove, which the Russians have been fighting over through the month of May. With this, the Russians will likely push through to Yasnobrodivka to gain control of it and gain control over the lakes here to the west of Yasnobrodivka. This will allow the Russians to strengthen their positions by Netailove and Umanske, to pressure the Ukrainian positions by Novoselivka Persha to the north and Karlivka to the west, Nevelska to the south. This will allow the Russians to expand offensive operations in multiple directions and start a new phase of fighting here in this section of the front line. But all of this requires Russian capture of Yasnobrodivka. Further south here in the direction of Novomikhailivka, the Russians have advanced both within Peraskovivka towards the central parts of the small village. This means that the Russians continue their offensive operations here in this direction and will likely continue to push towards the Dacha area following the capture of it. And to the southwest of Novomikhailivka, there's been this small advance as the Russians capture Ukrainian fortified positions here south of Konstantinivka. The Russians will likely continue positional fighting south of the town, similar to the direction of Novomikhailivka prior to the Russians' capture of Novomikhailivka. They had positions to the south, east, and north of the town. They'll likely try to repeat that here by Konstantinivka, where they'll push towards the Dacha area to the north of the river line that separates Konstantinivka and it. However, there are multiple layers of Ukrainian fortifications in the north, which makes it difficult. At the same time, a direct push from the east from Novomikhailivka and from the south from the Ukrainian fortifications in the area in the fields south of Konstantinivka. With this, heavy positional fighting continues here in the southern section of the Donetsk front as well. As a final point, the Russian President Vladimir Putin met with the Belarusian President Lukashenko. And in that meeting that lasted yesterday night towards the morning, they held a formal press conference together earlier today. And in that, both Lukashenko and Putin both said that Kiev's president, Ukraine's president Vladimir Zelensky, is no longer a legitimate ruler of Ukraine due to his term ending. Therefore, no negotiations can take place with him, considering that he is no longer the official president of Ukraine, according to them, based on the ending of his term. The Ukrainian constitution is unclear on what exactly to do due to the martial law and other stuff happening within Ukraine, which makes it difficult for elections to take place. Therefore, there is a gray zone. However, considering that both Putin and Lukashenko now have said clearly and straightforwardly that they do not consider Zelensky the leader of Ukraine any longer, they claim that they are ready to negotiate, but do not have anyone to negotiate with, as there's no official head of Ukraine. What this means, I'm not really sure, we'll have to see. But based on this, it is unlikely that the Russians will go for a negotiated peace on this conflict, but it will instead fight until the end of the military fights happening throughout the country. And with that, it will be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.